In this section of the tutorial, we're going to be talking with Marta Hallett about publishing. We are in her office here in Manhattan, New York, and she's going to take us through kind of how she got started, the do's and don'ts of publishing, and a little more about that side of the industry, so you have the knowledge moving forward should you want to get your works published in an actual book. So, Marta, first, thank you for having us. Really excited.
Thank you for interviewing me.
I'm very curious about a lot of this, so I want to start with kind of how you got into the industry and how you became a publisher.
It's a very long story because I've been doing this for a very long time. But I originally started working for a company that was doing very innovative work in terms of cooking and photography in the 70s even. And my first exposure to photography was working with Manuel Alvarez Bravo, who's one of the great luminaries of Mexican photography in the world, too, and putting together his portfolio. So at that point I became interested in photography, and I sort of slated myself as an illustrated book person. I was doing illustrated for color work when many other publishers and houses and editors were not experienced in that area. So I moved through various publishing houses, always working on illustrated books and trying to weave in as much as possible photography books, even when photography wasn't a particular mainstay of publishing as it is now. And I would say when I was the publisher of Rizzoli, which was my last stint before starting Glitterati, we started publishing more and more photography books because that was so much of an art house that we could have a wider list and include photography in it. And then when I began Glitterati, I think because this company is very much based on my personal interests and the kinds of books that I wanted to publish and that I thought there was a growing market for as well, we have really devoted ourselves in large part to photography, as the market happily has very much grown for books in that arena. And so we have a wide variety of photography books just because the category itself has become very diverse and large and has many different price points, territories, markets into which we can publish.
How has the industry changed throughout the years, especially with the advent of digital? How have you seen it change?
Well, I think that interestingly for us, and I think for most illustrated book publishers, digital is not so much of an issue. I think that for general fiction and nonfiction, it's had a huge impact because so many people are looking at their books on Kindle or iPads or whatever on their computers, because those are information-based books. Our books are different than that in that they, of course, have information, and sometimes they really are documentary in that way. But the stories that our books tell really need to be seen very often in a different kind of format, because the book format is different than an exhibition or a slideshow. You know, developing a book is a whole other entity. It's the difference, I always say, between you know, what's happened with digital is the difference between radio and television. That radio was everything, and then television came along, but radio didn't really go away. And illustrated books are the category of books that didn't really go away because they have an incredible distinction for the reader in terms of not just the visual aspect, but the size of the book, the format, the way the reproduction takes place, how it's bound, how it's designed is critical, obviously. So it's we really haven't been terribly impacted, and we actually are not in a position where we feel the need to make any of our books in a digital format, because I think the market is pretty set, and people who care about illustrated books will buy the book. They don't want to see it in a digital form.
Well, in many ways, they're investment pieces. So they can be investment pieces.
Can be.
They're coffee table books, but they're also just pieces of art. I know when I did my first interview, and actually the first day that I met Sandro, invited us into his house, and we sat down on his couch, and his complete back wall was over 800 or 900 books. And every single one of them were books that I'd never seen in things like, you know, Barnes & Noble or an actual place like that. And I was just so curious, like, how did he get all of these books? So talk to me a little bit about the publishing side. What do you guys, take me through your business. Like, how does the publisher work with the photographer? How does the book come to life?
Well, it's a very collaborative experience, and actually, very often I think it's more related to making a film almost, because it's not a linear process. When you're making a novel or even another kind of book of nonfiction, you start at point A and you end at point Z. We have a little bit of a different process. I mean, first of all, it's so collaborative that sometimes the concept leads the way, sometimes the words lead the way, sometimes the pictures lead the way, sometimes the design leads the way. So it's a constant balancing act of putting something together that in the end should be better because of the collaboration than it ever would have been if one person had done it on their own. Because you have an editorial process, so you have a photographer essentially choosing his or her photographs. I mean, what we do is we ask them to give us, by contract, the photographer has to do three things. They have to give us their artwork in a high-res printable format, any words that they plan to contribute to the book, whether that's an introduction or captions or even a text that accompanies, and they have to promise to help us promote the book seriously, because that's as important to publishing these books as actually making them beautifully and perfectly. So once they've turned that in, then we pull in our design people, our editorial people, and the whole process of collaboration begins. Because we usually ask our photographers to give us many more pictures than we actually think we'll need, because we want to be able to edit. And that editing involves telling the story in the best way, in the most beautiful way, making sure that we're servicing anyone that we think might want to buy the book, and we're moving the book in the direction of where the clientele might be in terms of levels of interest out there that we know about from having marketed this sort of work. And once the design and the editorial come together, we create a layout, we show it to the author, who then comments on the layout, and it goes back and forth until we actually have a final layout that goes off to the printer. Along the way of those various layouts, there can be all sorts of changes, and this is one of the quandaries, I think, for an illustrated publisher, is identifying at the get-go exactly what that book is going to be, because we don't know what it's going to be. We have books here that are 500 pages long that the original contract called for a 160-page book. But it turned out that to make the book what it really needed to be to tell the story, we needed, 358 pictures. That's kind of the exciting, wonderful part of it. It's difficult when we're trying to make catalog copy and tell people what the book is going to be in terms of marketing it early on. But it's about the book sort of morphing from the idea of what everyone has in mind to being, in the end, what it really should be, to talk in the best way and show in the best way what the subject is.
So the photographer and yourself both have equal creative control, or are you guys more pushing how it should look?
It kind of depends, really. I think that we try to make it an equal creative control, and that means that we spend a lot of time really trying to bring our photographers into the business and what we need to consider to make it an effective book, too. And I guess in the end, if it's a marketing decision, we push very hard to try to convince the author to why we're going in a certain direction. And usually that works out without any problem. I think that sometimes the authors, because they're visual people, have an idea already of what they think the book should be. And our goal is to take that germ and make it happen for them, but have them love what they see at the end and say, oh my gosh, I never imagined it could be that. And we feel the same way sometimes ourselves. And we try to bring all of our knowledge, not just in terms of marketing, but in terms of design, manufacturing. Our books in particular have lots of special features. We use gatefolds if that helps to tell an extended story that doesn't really sit along the flat narrative. If it's a book that you might want to stop and sort of think about, we put in a ribbon marker. We put a lot of acetate jackets on our books so that the consumer can take it home and just have a piece of art on their coffee table.
Very high quality.
So all of those things that may never have occurred to a photographer, are things that we try to build in, making sure that our book is totally distinctive.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about manufacturing. So you guys are doing everything in-house except the manufacturing. And from what I got from you in our previous meeting was a lot of this is outsourced overseas. Mm-hmm. It can be here. You use a lot of different places. So kind of walk me through that process.
We do. We've historically, illustrated books in this country have been manufactured in Asia, principally in China, because you can find very high quality. First of all, there are many, many printers. There are lots of printers of 4-color or beyond 5-color and 6-color and 7-color books. So there's a lot of variety of printers, and there's a lot of variety in terms of what many of them can do. Some of them specialize in certain areas. Some of them specialize in special features, like putting in gatefolds or being able to create a book in a certain way because of the kinds of presses that they have, the paper that they have in stock regularly that doesn't have to be special ordered, all of those things. So mostly the books are produced in Asia. However, we had a production manager in England at one point who was working with Slovenian printers who were fantastic and have done some of our best books. We found that the quality was always equal in coming from Asia to anything that we were able to achieve anywhere else, and it was almost always less expensive.
Sure.
So, and they also, because of the historical aspect of Asian printers working with Westerners in terms of making books in the UK, Europe, and America, there are no issues to overcome in terms of the actual the crazy issues like shipping or how do you carton the books, how do they get shipped so that they go into the warehouse properly and all of that sort of thing. So anyway, that's our primary source, and some books we have done in Europe, in Slovenia, as I mentioned. We've done some books in Italy because we have an Italian author, a short deadline, and of course the Italians make beautiful books too, and always have. And then sometimes we print our books in Canada as well. If we have a short deadline on something or we need a quick reprint of a book that can be made in Canada, because of course the shipping time is non-existent from Canada. So, every book is sort of modulated in terms of who's going to be the designer for it, how are we going to structure it, what will our relationship be with our author, where are we going to print it, when should it best be published in terms of what season, what time of year, how are we going to move it? Is it going to be a book that sells principally to the trade, which is booksellers or companies that sell so many books that they can be qualified as booksellers, like Anthropology? Or are we going to do equally as much or more business on sort of special events with authors having exhibitions or doing lectures, or how do those two things come together in terms of ultimately marketing and moving the book to the audiences where they belong?
In the manufacturing process, do you get to go to China and see these actually come off and be made and approve it there, or how does the first book get approved? Do they send you a copy?
Yes, it's kind of a long process because we send the mechanicals. We usually specify, now we make mechanicals with PDFs, which is a whole new revolution in printing.
And what are mechanicals?
So the mechanicals are the actual setup for the printers, so they understand what's on each 2-page spread.
Okay.
They understand where the pages are going to trim, because the books are printed on sheets that are bigger than the pages.
Sure.
So when you see the trim size of a book is 8.5 by 11, that means the internal pages are trimmed at 8.5 by 11, and the cover of the book is always slightly larger than that. So we send them the mechanical. We designate possibly as many as 10 pages that we want to see proofed on, either as a digital form, which is 99% accurate for color, or actual printed. If we think it's going to be extraordinarily complicated, we will ask them to print up, say, 10 pages on the actual paper that the book is going to be printed on. That comes in, we look at it, we make sure it's all accurate, and it is pretty much, because what they're doing is highly electronic.
Sure.
Essentially, the whole printing process has changed a lot over the last years because the printers are getting these electronic PDFs, which they're just outputting essentially. All the correction has already been made to the artwork on the PDF that they get in the first place. Mm-hmm. So sometimes there can be a slight variation where the photographer who actually creates that artwork and gives it to us, not the mechanical, but the actual artwork that goes into the PDFs, maybe they've made everything slightly darker than it really needs to be. So that's why we get some samples to see how to mitigate that. But basically what they get, the printer, is what comes out. So the short answer is we don't really have to go to Asia anymore, number one. But number two, even when we had to go to Asia, we didn't go to Asia because we deal with a certain number of printers who know what our standard of quality is. So we were very lucky. It was much more boutique-y in those days, and we dealt with many fewer printers. And essentially, especially when the company was smaller, we had one printer that we dealt with at Glitterati who knew exactly what our standards were, and they produced to it. So anyway, back to the process. They send us proofs. We approve or don't approve. We make some slight corrections. Then they send us a full set of digital proofs, usually showing us the entire book so that we can look at the color throughout and make sure that the proofing process is really about color.
Sure.
Then you get blueprints, which are the old-fashioned name. It was blueprints. They're not really blue anymore. They're all sorts of different colors. But they're on a sort of standard lesser grade stock, and those are to make sure that the stripping of the book is proper, that none of the pages are upside down or the signatures aren't placed in the wrong position, and the words are all okay, and you've got your ISBN matching on the cover and the inside of the book. And then once you approve that, they actually print the books. And what they do is they do send advances of finished copies to us, usually a couple of weeks, or when those books come off press, they send them to us by air, by courier, so that we can see some finished copies and approve it and make sure everything is perfect before we say, okay, those books are ready to ship. Now, while we're doing that, they are packing the books, they are palletizing the books. So if there's an issue, they have to undo things, but basically, there isn't an issue usually.
It sounds like a very lengthy process. So can you kind of take me through the average duration from design to distribution? How long do these usually take?
Well, in terms of the actual time you must give to it, we usually give a year. So from the point that the author delivers to us the art and the manuscript, it usually takes us a year to the publication date. And the publication date is usually a month after the book is actually in our warehouse and ready to ship. Mm-hmm. Because it is lengthy. I mean, you have the shipping time, which is usually a month. Then it has to come to port, it has to get through port, get to the warehouse, be stocked. Then it has to be laid down, which means sent out to anyone who's placed an order for it. And so all of that takes time. It moves fairly swiftly, nonetheless it's a couple of months of time. So the actual making of the book, it probably takes no more than 6 or 8 weeks for the printer to be ready to print and print the book and get it shipped. But there are millions of steps along the way.
Yeah, and throughout this process of making this tutorial with Sandro, I've learned a lot about his process and how long he dedicates to actually collecting the images. Like his biker series, his Cuba series took, I think, 14 years before he was finally happy.
Malkovich, 17 years.
Yeah, so this
and he's
one's
still
17.
working.
Yeah. I think for me and a lot of people in the millennials, very impatient. For me, just the thought process of spending 15 years on a project, I can't even fathom.
Trust me, as someone who's way beyond those 15 years, I can't believe either that you could be doing some of these things for as long as you're doing them. But the time does go pretty swiftly, and I think that for a lot of our photographers, we have many photographers on our roster who are in their 80s and who we're doing life's work with. And so sometimes the books come from the archives of the photographer. And sometimes they come from an ongoing project, which is either the project of their life's work or the project of a singular topic. And I think we do see that kind of, especially with younger photographers, speed that they're able to attribute to it. And maybe that's partially to because of the digital era of photography, that you can take many more pictures much faster now than you could 35 years ago,
Sure.
you know? Because the process, it's done once you've finished it almost. There's not the whole development process and all of that.
What books have done the best? What books sell more than others? What makes a solid book? Or is it just a combination of a lot of things?
I think it is a combination, but I think the most critical feature for us is we think that every book we make is a really good book, that we've properly packaged it, we've created what it should be. But the really critical feature, I think, is having the authors be involved in promoting the book. For the reason that you explained. You don't go into Barnes & Noble anymore and see, you know, racks and racks of illustrated books. They're focusing on bestsellers. And you know what they perceive as the most mass, in a way, in terms of what they're going to gather the most interest in by the largest audience. A lot of illustrated books aren't really made on that basis. You know, they're made because it is a specific topic. It is niche. It is special. And so it's really important for the publishers to have the authors involved and engaged in helping to bring their audience to the publisher, so that we can reach out to as wide of their as wide a niche as possible, essentially. And so I don't even know how I would actually quantify what's the most successful, you know, because just because we sell the most of one book doesn't necessarily mean it's the most successful. I think the thing that we've learned over these years is it's about the author really being dedicated to putting as much energy into helping us get the word out about the book as actually helping us get the best material to put into it, you know?
I know after my first interview with Sandro, I was so inspired to start my book collection. And the first thing I did is I went to, I think it was a Barnes & Noble, and then I was quickly disappointed because none of the books that he had, like the bigger ones, the really collector books, weren't there. So how is Sandro?
Where are they?
Yeah, where are these books? How can we find these books? How do I get them?
Well, I think you find them two ways. I mean, some of these books, and this is why we really, our promotion and marketing of the books is so widespread. Sometimes somebody like Sandro has galleries all over the country, all over the world. So we, as a publisher, make sure to try to tie in with those endeavors, because some of those people may never go to a bookstore, which is another place they might find some of his books. So a lot of his books are probably coming from gallery exhibitions that he's attended. Some of the books he has because he's probably read about them. We have a huge press outreach for our books, both in terms of social media, electronic media. You know, right now, as you know, Sandro's doing an interview for CBS about his book. We try to get national and local electronic, and then we spend a lot of time doing lectures, going to art schools, identifying where the student population might be that would be interested. And then our press person also has contacts with all of the right kind of print press, which is very critical for us, so that some of our books might be reviewed in the Daily Mail in London, Vanity Fair. We have a book now that was on the cover of People magazine, Vanity Fair, New York Social Diary, and all of those things are vehicles that are read by our audience. And those people then can go online and buy the book online. And so Amazon is a critical tool, I think, for illustrated publishers in particular, because they are the means by which the consumer who finds out about our books can actually get them. And also, you know, Amazon does this fantastic thing where they downprice the books from the list price almost automatically on every title, so that the books become more affordable than they might be if you encountered them in another venue. But the books do go to every place that somebody will order them. That's the important thing that authors sometimes forget, is that we can only ship as many books as somebody orders. We can't force somebody, you know, people will say, oh, this should be, you know, in the Metropolitan Museum, but we can't force the Metropolitan Museum. The best we can do is have a really terrific sales force, which we do, who goes to all of those places and makes a really good representation about what the books are.
Well, I think, especially with this tutorial, a lot of our viewers, this is their ultimate goal. It's one thing to get your stuff published in a magazine.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge accomplishment for photographers, seeing your work in print. The next level of that is seeing your work in something like
Mm-hmm.
this. So can you kind of walk me through, how did you meet Sandro? What was the first project you guys worked on? And just kind of how did that relationship begin?
Well, actually, Sandro came to us in the way that many of our authors come to us, which is why our list keeps growing. And that is through one of our other favorite authors, Christopher Makos, who is somebody that we've been publishing since we first started. Maybe our first publication was in, say, 2004. And, I think a really wonderful relationship with an author-artist is when you really connect with that person and it becomes a sort of long-term relationship from which many things come. And we have that relationship with Christopher. And Christopher was in LA and went to Fahey Klein Gallery and saw Sandro's homage show. And I think Sandro said he was coming to New York to meet with publishers. And Chris said, oh, well, you have to meet with my publisher. They
Sure.
do very special books at Glitterati. And so that's how we met. And Sandro came, and I said, this is incredible. I mean, the homage work is so amazing.
Yeah.
And then to realize there was this whole long-term aspect to it made it just irresistible, basically.
Sure.
But some of our authors come that way. Some of them, I read a lot of the photography press, Loy and the various journals, and I'll see people's work showcased and think, ooh, that's something that would be interesting to do in book form. Some come through general submissions. And then we have a lot of repeats, people like Christopher, Douglas Kirkland, Sandro, I hope, Jean-Pierre Lafont, people who we do a book with them. It's such a happy experience for both of us that we develop new books together,
Mm-hmm.
or if they develop a book, they come to us and say, gee, I'd like to do this, or vice versa. I'll say, I was thinking about your X pictures, maybe we could do that. So it's a very organic kind of exciting thing. It's fun.
What's the minimum amount of books that you'll do in a publication to make?
Well, we usually don't do less than 2,500 as a first printing. And we do that for a variety of reasons. The first is that it allows us to have a smallish print run, and sometimes in this day and age of storage costs being so high,
Yeah.
it's less expensive for us to reprint that book than to print, say, 5,000 copies, and if they don't all move quickly, have them sit in the warehouse
Yeah.
and have to pay to store them. But there are really, I think, more important marketing reasons to do that. And it is that it gives us the opportunity to move the book in different directions if indeed it is successful with those first 2,500. Because we do think in some ways of our books as a database. You're looking here at a table full of hardcovers, but these books could be in paperback, they could be all sorts of other kinds of formats of actual book.
Yeah.
They could be made smaller, they could be made bigger, they could do a lot of different things. And if we've moved through our first 2,500 relatively quickly, which we hope will happen at least within a year, it gives us the opportunity to then look at that body of work and say, okay, what are we going to do with this? Do we reprint that book? Do we reprint that book and create a deluxe edition with
Sure.
a print? Do we, as I think I have mentioned to you, we produce books in French in France. That reprint gives us an opportunity to produce the book in French, find other publishers around the world who might want a co-edition with us. So producing small runs allows us to be flexible about really maximizing the impact of the work in various formats, really.
Awesome. Let's imagine that I'm a young photographer and I come up with this body of work, let's say on the Freemasons or something like that. And I also have no following, I have no means of an audience, and I come to you. What are your concerns with that? If the work's good, but you're also looking at, you probably won't be able to promote this whatsoever.
There are a few things. I mean, one is, do we already have a a history of books into the channel into which this book would go, you know? So that's number one. Number two is, does the subject itself support the book being of interest to people without you having to have a profile? Just great pictures on a topic that people love. Is it a story that nobody else has told before that we can promote in a way that will bring attention to you and the work? So I wouldn't say that the author not having a sort of repertoire of people behind them really stands in the way necessarily. I think that if we think that the work is really strong and we can move it through the channels that we normally work in, and the author is willing to help us do that. I mean, the author always has to be willing, let's put it that way. But I think that we try very hard because we try to publish very distinctive books, we tend to look very closely at books that might fall into the category that you're talking about, or the art that would fall into that category.
Are there any upfront costs for the photographer to get his work published, or he comes to you, gives you all his work or her work, and it's...
That's pretty much the way it works. We try not to pay advances to authors because we spend so much effort and expense on actually making the most beautiful books, and we like to be able to put all of our finance into that. So usually we just ask that the authors come to us with their photography intact and provide that to us so that we don't have to do anything to it. So that it's already scanned, it's in a digitized form at, say, 350 dpi to what we think the trim size of the page is going to be, and then whatever words they have. But no, I think if you decided to shoot something, that's a little bit of a different story. If you have an idea about doing something, then you might have some upfront costs. But oftentimes these are projects that the photographers already have the work in hand for one reason or another.
Sure. Can we talk a little bit about the first author's book gets published? Are they actually making money if the first 2,500 sell, or is this more of a they're so happy that they got their stuff published?
They should make money. I mean, how much money will they make? I don't know. But if we do a 2,500 copy first printing and all of those books sell and the author has not received an advance for that book, they will make money on those 2,500 copies. And the royalties are usually somewhere between 5 and 10% of the list price of the net price of the book, which is 50% of the list price.
Okay.
And actually this is an important thing to mention, because most publishers of non-illustrated fiction and nonfiction pay their royalties on the list price, which is the suggested retail price of the book. We pay it on 50% of that, which is our wholesale price, for the reason that our books are so expensive.
Sure.
That essentially if you're making 5% on a $60 book, that's like making 10% on a $30 book. So the royalties are actually quite fair and decent. But yes, but that presumes that we sell all of the books too. You know, but on a first printing, theoretically, if all those books sell, the author will make money.
So let's get into Sandro's book that is actually coming out soon. Or
yes,
is it already out?
I think, I'm not even sure what the pub date is, but I think it's in the next few days.
In the next few days. So yeah, today Sandro is actually at CBS promoting this book, so he's actually traveling right now when he can to promote the book. So let's go through Sandro's book here. What is this going to sell for?
This book is, you can always tell the list price down here in the barcode, $95 is the suggested list price.
And where will people be able to get a book like this?
Well, they will be able to get it at any signing that he does that we set up at any gallery. They'll be able to get it at any bookseller. I mean, one thing you should remember is that just like Amazon, a bookseller, even if they don't have a book, if somebody reads about it and goes in and asks for it, Barnes & Noble, every independent bookseller will order that book for the client, for the customer. And they'll probably have it there within 48 hours. So it's not as though the booksellers don't sell these books, but if they feel that they're too big in a small store.
Sure.
They take up too much space, or they don't have the wherewithal to have them there. They will always order a book for you. So this book is available, as they say in the ads, everywhere books are sold. There isn't any bookseller you couldn't get this book from, including Amazon, including Barnes & Noble, including Rizzoli Bookstore.
Sure.
Everywhere, basically.
So walk
Online.
me through how this was made. When Sandro came to you with the work, this is 17 years of John Malkovich that the relationship kind of cultivated back in theater, for those of you that don't know. So kind of walk me through how this book was made from the idea to
Well, you know,
this print.
Sandro is one of those people who is very, very collaborative, very creative, which is a special kind of person. To be collaborative in that way, you have to be a brainstormer.
Sure.
And you have to not get upset if somebody else says something crazy in an effort to come up with a really good idea, or what you suggest doesn't actually come to pass.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he has that relationship with John Malkovich, which you can tell through this book, because you can see the book contains not only the end result of what they're doing, but you begin to see the collaboration that went into it, because the backstory is there as well.
Yeah.
So Sandro came after he had this exhibition in LA and showed me the work, and I said, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. Of course, we have to publish this.
Yeah.
And he had an idea about what he wanted to do, that he didn't want to do just the homage work, which is the iconic photographs
Sure.
revisited by
Yeah.
these two. That he wanted to lead up to it with the portraiture that they had worked on first, and actually the cover is one of those pictures, and also include some of the film work that they've done together, some stills from the films. And so we decided, okay, this was going to be kind of a big, massive monograph, which is why we wanted it to have a big size. And the artwork is so painterly in some ways, in
Yeah.
terms of the scale of it. You want to present it in a big book. So we pretty much agreed on how we were going to do it. We sent him our sort of standard contract. We wanted to do it quickly, so he suggested that, and oftentimes our author photographers will do this, they provide us with a layout, which is a sequencing of the photographs, so that at least we know where they want to go with this visually. To begin, we might argue with that,
Sure.
but at least it gives us a place to start, so our designers don't do something that has nothing to do with the way they think it should go. So that was provided to us, and we then said, oh, okay, well, we think we might like to move a few of these things here, we might like to do this or that. We went kind of back and forth on very precise elements. How much color was there going to be in it, in terms of how many inks were we going to use. Of course, I think Sandra wanted to use 7 inks. And we said, how about if we do 5 inks? And so we compromised on 5
I'm guessing
inks.
that gets pretty pricey to do 7.
It gets crazy.
Yeah.
And it also means that you have genuine issues of physics, which I know sounds
Yeah.
crazy, but, paper is an organic substance. So if you put too many things on it, there can be
Sure.
problems with it. But in addition, you have to have a printer that can do that, or you have to run it through the press multiple times. There are all sorts of issues. And so we went back and forth on all of those kinds of issues. And I think that between us, sort of looking at it and looking at it and looking at it and going back and forth, we kind of put together what is pretty much of a perfect book.
It's beautiful.
And I think that we were both surprised when we got it, that it was so fantastic and so kind of monumental. And even we were talking about the cover yesterday, because originally I was thinking, oh, well, we'll put one of the homage photographs on the cover. And Sandra said, no, I think we should not do that, because people will think it's a Diane Arbus book or something.
Oh, sure.
And I thought, well, that's pretty smart. Of course he's right about that. So then we kind of went back to the front portrait section, and we had chosen another picture other than this one, actually, which is Malkovich looking at himself in a mirror, starting to put on makeup, which is kind of an amazing picture. But we felt that was almost too backstory in a way, too. We didn't want this to seem like it was sort of only the backstory of how
Sure.
all of this work is done. And so we looked at a lot of pictures together and decided that this really worked, because it's crazy, wonderful, fanciful, but you also know it's John Malkovich. You know who you're looking at. And but those kinds of things sometimes take a good bit of time of really thinking about how the book is going to be processed by consumers. And I think that's one of the important things about covers, which do often present controversy between author and publisher, because our thing is making a cover that if it's sitting on a table and people walk by it in a bookstore, it will stop them dead in their tracks.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to tell everything that's in the book. If it can tell everything in the book, maybe it shouldn't be a book, it should be a poster, The book is obviously much more intense and in depth than what you see on the cover. But it needs to be somewhat representative, and it needs to just stop people dead in their tracks.
Yeah. Talk to me about the paper that was chosen. Was this, did Sandra pick it out? Did you pick it out?
No, this is kind of our standard paper. We use a 170 GSM matte art paper for most of our books, or I believe in the case of this is a 157 Chinese matte art, which is a very beautiful, special Chinese paper that bulks up particularly well and is very toothy, which means it's pretty spongy. And it absorbs, the ink sits on it nicely, but it absorbs the ink when it needs to in the dark areas. And it's just a really rich paper. That said, that's kind of our standard paper, but we do vary our papers depending on what we need to do. And sometimes we'll run a flood varnish on top of the paper because we want it to have a little bit more of a gloss, or we'll do different things to the paper. But this is pretty much our standard paper, and it's very delicious. It doesn't have a lot of show through. It's it's a really rich paper.
Yeah, there's just something so awesome and tactile about having the actual book that digital will never ever replace.
I agree 1,000,000%.
Yeah. Let's get into the stories, the kind of the backstories of a few other books. Walk me through this one.
Well, this is a great book, and this is one of those books where the author has a following, but it's very niche, and he's now probably in his 50s. But when he was 14 years old, he followed his brothers into all of the downtown clubs on the Bowery. And they were 3 brothers, here they are on the cover, from Queens, and they wanted to have a band. And he was 14 and his brothers were like 17 and 20, so they could go into the club, or 18 and 20. And he had his little camera with him. I don't know if it was an Instamatic or whatever. And he was completely invisible to everyone in there. And he ran around taking pictures. But of course, the people at that club at that time were Blondie and Chris Stein and all the people that are now these luminaries from the sort of punk era where it all started. And so this book has done very well based on its subject.
Sure.
The pictures are fantastic, don't get me wrong. But it's something that it's a record of something that only he could have done. And that's what we try to make sure all of our books are, is something that's quite distinctive. That there are lots of books on this era, but there's nothing quite like this where the work had never been reproduced before. He'd been very careful about guarding his photographs and not kind of letting them be printed here and there over the years.
So he held on to these for a number of years.
He held on to them for a long time, and then realized that maybe this would be time to put it all together in a book. And so we were the fortunate recipient of knowing that. And he, again, was was sent to us by Pat Loud, who was another one of our authors, and the mother of Lance Loud, who was also part of this whole group of people that were sort of downtown in the 70s, I guess. So anyway, it's a fantastic book. It's sold very well all over the world because I think the pictures have never before been seen and are very distinctive, and it is of an era, and it's a tight story of an era,
One thing I've noticed about all these books that you have, none of them are the same size. So how do you come up with how to size the book?
That is a great thing that you just brought up. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's a critical feature of our books. Many publishers have certain sizes they use for their books because they're more economical sizes based on when you print a book, what size paper you use and how much of it you waste when you're printing the book, essentially, through trimming. We actually don't do that. We try to accommodate the artwork.
Sure.
So we set our trim sizes, and that's why, again, our contract is kind of crazy sometimes, because we'll say something's going to be 9 by 11. This happened the other day. We had slated a book to be 9 by 11. And when we sent the pictures to the designer to say, you know, we want it to look like this, we would have had to trim too much of the pictures, or we couldn't do full bleeds. And also because we're doing, that happened to be a lifestyle book, it wasn't a photography book. But certainly with the photography books, we have to be really sensitive about what is the scale and size of the artwork. We're not interested in trimming people's original artworks.
Sure.
So, and oftentimes we want to do full bleeds. So we utilize the original artwork and we create the trim size around that. That's the short answer. And that's why there are all these different wacky sizes.
Sure.
In this book, for example, a lot of the art was, you know, little 4x6 sort of snapshotty things. So we couldn't make it gigantic because we would have blown out the pictures and they wouldn't have been readable, essentially. But otherwise, these books are all made to really accommodate the artwork.
So does it help in any way that the photographer shoots to the same crop, and for the most part they're the same aspect ratio? Or
you know, not really. I think that if we have a variety of things, which we do, for example, with somebody like Sandro or Douglas, who've been shooting with different kinds of cameras, you know, different things throughout their career, we try to identify what works best.
Okay.
And the designer, we work with very good designers who are all people who understand photography and are very careful about, in their design, if something's going to bleed, making sure that it isn't cropped when it bleeds.
New York.
Here we are, the horns. Somebody agrees with that out there, obviously.
At least there's not a jackhammer.
There's a photographer out there somewhere honking his horn to agree with that. Yeah. So, you know, I think that oftentimes if it's a story, like somebody like Marjorie, when she was shooting her book, was using the same camera, the same lenses, the same everything. So all of the art that came in, because it's the same story kind of, was pretty much the same size and format and all of that. But other books, you know, that's not the case. And then the designers work sensitively to not have something bleed if you're going to have to crop it to bleed or whatever.
It sounds like a really fun part of the creative process of, like, what's this book going to look like?
It is, because it's, you know, it makes our lives much more difficult because each book is totally individual in terms of the way we construct it from the get-go. But it's also what makes it really fun and interesting and a challenge, you know, because we could make a mistake and, you know, we could see something in proof and think, I don't know, what did we do? Yeah. Fortunately, we're pretty good at not having that happen. I can't really think of when that did happen. But, you know, it keeps everybody on their toes and lively and interested in what they're doing, because nothing is exactly the same as anything else. But let me say this, that's not just about our books. I think we go over the edge with that, but every book is a different entity. You know, you can have a bestseller in fiction that the next book by that author, you think you're putting it in the same pipeline and it just doesn't sell the same way. So that's one of the great things about publishing in general, is every book is its own new endeavor.
Have you already started to kind of visualize or talk with Sandro about the Papua New Guinea portraits and what the size of the book?
Well, I've thought about it in my brain based on what you showed me yesterday, but I haven't really talked to him about it. But I do think that based on what we saw yesterday, we could do some really interesting things, maybe of integrating the film aspect of it with the photography aspect, you know, the still.
To come out.
Could be kind of intense and wonderful.
Very impatient. I want it to come out soon.
Yeah, well, this is, you see, we have the same impatience.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell because everybody's so calmly at their computers here, but there's a lot of chaos going on back there.
It was interesting. He said in Papua New Guinea, you know, from the work that we have now, this would be enough, probably. Then the publisher would go to print with it, but it's not good enough for me, and I'm coming back. So he's going back. He's trying to convince me to go back in July, which I hope I can. But it'll be really exciting to see what else he gets.
I think that, you know, the more dimension we can have to these works, in terms of the actual artwork itself. I mean, that's one of the great things about the Malkovich book is this could have been just a superficial photography book with the homage pictures. No, it's the entire 17 years. And it's not even just that. It's these intensive interviews. And so it services so much more of an audience. People who are collectors, people who recognize the classics and want to look more closely at the homage pictures. People want to understand the process, both students and aficionados of photography. You know, because that's a really critical part of what we're trying to do with these books too, is make them entities that you don't stand in the bookstore and flip through it and say, oh, very nice, and feel like you've gotten it. You have to buy these books and take them home and look at them because they're so rich and there's so much going on. And even if it isn't a lot of words, it's an intensity of presentation of the artwork, you know.
So if he shoots for 5-10 more years with John Malkovich, will that be something that's added to this book and recreated in version 2? Or
no, I think it would be another book.
It would just be another book. Okay.
Mm-hmm. We don't. We have actually done a couple of where we've worked with authors, mostly in art rather than photography. But you'll see over there, there's a box set of a book that we had just too much material for one book, so we made it a box set. I mean, we do what the content needs rather than, and that's not to say we don't take into account what the market needs and everything else, but we really try not to make the format what the book is.
Gotcha.
We try to make the book conform to, the format conform to what the content is.
Well, the next book that I want to talk about has an amazingly inspirational story that I think a lot of our viewers will get inspired by.
Mm-hmm.
Walk me through this process. How did this happen?
Well, this is a fantastic book, I have to say, and the work is unbelievable, totally unique. I am a portfolio reviewer at the Palm Springs Photo Festival. Mm-hmm. And so that means I sit at a table and, every half hour another person comes along with their portfolio. And my job at that endeavor is to suggest to them if the material they have is publishable in a general way, specifically if it is or is not, how could it either be made that way or why is it not suitable in some way. And frankly, it's a lot of fun for me because it forces me to draw on all sorts of levels of knowledge that I think I have. Maybe I don't actually have, but I think I have. This woman, Marjorie Salvatierra, is an LA-based photographer, and she had really not shown her work to too many people. She had shown it to David Fahey, who she told me liked it a lot, which was a good recommendation because he's a premier gallerist. And I started looking at it, and one of the things that I think students should always remember is to make a nice presentation. So that what I looked at were beautifully printed black and white prints that were much bigger than what you would see in a book, but it was a very nice presentation. So I could see really the quality of the technology of what she was doing, that they were beautiful prints, no matter whether they had been terrible subjects. They were beautifully made, and she was really working well. I think, honestly, I don't know if it was digital or film, but they were just really rich prints. And then there were these incredible pictures. And, that's something we're always looking for, is really books that haven't been done before.
Sure.
Work that is appealing, but probably you've never seen before. And interestingly, I always have a hard time describing this book because it is something that it's hard to relate to anything I'd seen before, but she got this sort of group of women together and in this incredibly artistic and beautiful fine art photography way started making photographs that sort of relate to the status of women.
Yeah.
But instead of it being, and everything ranging from housewives to laundresses to whatever, but instead of it being a sort of serious sociological study, they're beautiful, beautiful artworks that are also incredibly witty, funny, smart, elegant.
Yeah, definitely original when I was looking through it.
Unbelievable. I mean, I'd never seen it. And so I was looking at it, I said, gee, Marjorie, these are fantastic. I love this. I said, I would be interested in talking to you about doing a book, which of course
right
shocked
there,
her.
right there on the spot.
Because she thought she was getting a portfolio review, and
Yeah.
I was like, this could be a good book. I like this. It's beautiful. And so we just followed up with each other after the fair. And I don't know how often that happens. We're a small company. We have the ability, that's one of the great things I think about Glitterati, is we have the ability to make a decision at a moment's notice.
Sure.
And say, hey, this is fantastic. We're going to publish this. We're going to get behind it. I talked to her a little about the fact that she was in LA, how we would be able to promote it. But again, she is somebody who is a young woman. This is her first book. She doesn't have huge contacts that would be brought to help us promote it. But I think the subject is so original. The work is so beautiful. And we have a lot of contacts, of course.
Sure.
We're pretty inured into the photography world, so we can see ourselves moving this book throughout the fine art photography, sort of documentary photography. We brought to the project Roxane Gay to write a foreword, to bring it a little more to the contemporary young reader. And so together we were noodling this so that it would be really, really strong. And I think it's a really, really strong representation of her work and book. And I think it's going to do really, really well.
How long did it take from that initial meeting to have the actual book?
Well, you're going to laugh. A year.
1 year.
Because the Palm
Did
Springs...
this happen last year?
Yep.
So this book just came out?
It's about to publish.
Oh, it's about to come out.
It's about to publish. I think, I don't know if we have all of our inventory yet, but I think it's in the next 2 or 3 weeks it will publish.
Awesome. So by the time you're watching this, the
It will
book
be
is
in
going to be out.
bookstores.
So it's going to be in bookstores, and if you've been watching this interview, you can go to any bookstore and request it.
Exactly. Or
Look
you
at me
can buy it
learn.
on Amazon or
Yes,
barnesandnoble.com or anywhere.
Let's talk about the last book here that we have here.
Yes.
This is a piece of art.
It is, and these are the books that, one of the reasons that we often do our 2,500 copy first printings.
Sure.
Because if we have a book that sells very well, now this we happen to do with the first printing, but oftentimes we will use these limited editions to extend the life of a book.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a book that does very well, we did that with, I think, our Ann Menke book, which isn't right here, but the book sold and sold and sold in its regular edition. So about a year and a half later, we said, let's do a limited edition, because we can re-promote that limited edition as a new book to get more interest in it. And what we do is, we do it fairly standard, although you can see our Botero books up there, we just put in a lucite case rather than boxing them, and we put his signature onto the lucite case. But in most cases, what we do is we create a box for the book. We enclose in it it's a limited edition of 100 copies. We put in a print that's made by the artist and signed and numbered, which can be hung or kept with this. And then we include the book, which is, in this case, we have this crazy little string thing that helps you pull it out. And in the case of this book is exactly like the original book. Sometimes we dress up the limited edition a little bit. We might change the cloth on the case and put French fold on it. This original book had all of those luxe details anyway. We put it in this box, and we sell these for a much, usually somewhere between more than $250 each. And what they're meant to be is a medium between the original book, which is, I believe, $75, and a print for this of this, which would be, $5,000 maybe. And they come shrink wrapped, and then they have this on the back, which tells the consumer, what the book is about, what's in it, et cetera, et cetera. Mostly we sell these at events, a gallery event. They're kind of expensive to be placing in bookstores, and the bookstores don't necessarily have the space, plus they have to have one open to show. But we have, for example, with our Coco Chanel, I think we're on our 4th limited edition. Because it just really works. You get a beautiful print, and it gives people a way to actually have artwork without having to spend the thousands of dollars
Sure.
sometimes that this artwork can command.
Well, Sandro was telling me a lot of these limited edition special, only 100 were made. He has a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
And he was telling me that some that he bought for, 800 to 1,000 are now worth 15 to 20,000.
Yeah. No, these, I think they're highly collectible.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this a little yesterday, Sandro and I, because we have people sometimes who will buy these at events and they don't even open them up because all of our books come shrink wrapped. And obviously if you come to an event, most people are coming to get a signed edition of the book. But in the case of some of these, people will just buy them and keep them shrink wrapped because that allows them to escalate in value.
Sure.
Because they're completely untouched, basically, 20 years later or however many years later. And I know that some artists, when they sell portfolios of their prints, as they have fewer and fewer, they raise the prices of those because they become more and more scarce. We don't do that, but we do anticipate that they're being bought many times as an investment, essentially.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go broke just from, I want to get to that collection that Sandro has, and I want to start collecting these books, and it's been just really motivational to see his passion because, when I ask him, like, what's your inspiration? How are you learning? And he says, all through books.
Mm-hmm.
That's his source to keep teaching himself and be inspired by other photographers is these beautiful works of art.
I think it's true because you do, especially now, as we were saying, there are so many different avenues of photography. I mean, there are so many new techniques that are constantly being explored, so many different subjects that you can show and talk about, so much more access that people have. I mean, look, there are books now where people have taken pictures on their iPhones. Who would have thought 20 years ago that normal people or fine art photographers would be running around with iPhones taking pictures?
Literally everyone running around taking pictures with their iPhones.
Exactly. So it is a whole new landscape, and I think it's pretty exciting because it's being finally treated as an art form.
Yeah.
I mean, it was always, even in the 70s when I was working with Alvarez Bravo or people of that ilk, the great photographers, but it was considered a remote art form and only the artists could practice it. Now people are really, on a much more mass basis, becoming art photographers or photographers who are artists, and it's really fun to see.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly why we made this tutorial, is to help guide, new and seasoned photographers through the process of not only creating that body of work, but, educating them on the printing process and also on the publishing process. So I think this has been incredibly insightful for me because I was in the dark about all of this. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us and tell us about the publishing process. If you'd like to explore their website and see a lot of the other books or order a book, you can find them at www.glitteradincorporated.com.